This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 8th of October, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks. Michael Wade is still trying to join. He will be with us in just a few moments. In fact, even though I see him trying to hook up into Zoom here, he appears to be hooked up in such a way that he can't hear me yet. So we will go to Michael whenever he finally arrives. I suppose the one thing that we should talk about on the podcast today, the very first thing that we should talk about, is the attacks that Hamas carried out and is still carrying out in terms of rockets against Israel. This appears to be the largest and most dedicated, largest and most well-planned terrorist attack since 9/11. So it is, there we can see Michael is with us. Let me give you some volume here. Hello, Michael.
Hey, how are y'all doing?
We're doing fine. I will mess around with your volume here to try to get you set up right. So it's one of those things that is, the more details that we learn about what happened, the more horrific this attack seems to be. I would point out, however, what the State Department's initial response yesterday was in a tweet that has since been deleted, but is still screenshotted. The U.S. Office of Palestinian Affairs, a department of the United States State Department that deals specifically with Palestine, the Palestinian issue. We unequivocally condemn the attack of Hamas terrorists and the loss of life that is incurred. We urge all sides to refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks. Terror and violence solve nothing. Guess who appears to disagree with you? Hamas. They seem to believe that terror and violence...
And the Ukraine.
Yeah, they seem to believe that violence does, in fact, solve something. In fact, it did get rid of that pesky Imperial Japanese Nazi Germany problem in the early 1940s. And then there are... I keep hitting the wrong thing. And then there are these takes. The war that's going on in Israel and Palestine, especially that is directly affecting the people of Gaza and Hamas, I will not blame anyone or put on religion such as Islam or Christianity. All I know is I'm standing with peace. May the souls of the resting people rest in peace. And let's pray for peace. War is not a good thing. Well, thank you for that weigh-in from the kindergarten back row. But I think the thing that makes most sense to me, and probably one of the best takes I've seen on this so far today, actually comes from Sam Harris, who actually posted this today, and there is and this is a transcript, and I actually want to take the time to actually listen to this and view the transcript in its entirety. And of course, this will be better if I am not narrating it, if we let Sam Harris do it.
The truth is that everything you need to know about the moral imbalance between Israel and her enemies can be understood on the topic of human shields. Who uses human shields? Well, Hamas certainly does. They shoot their rockets from residential neighborhoods, from beside schools and hospitals and mosques. Muslims in other recent conflicts in Iraq and elsewhere have used human shields. They have laid their rifles on the shoulders of their own children and shot from behind their bodies. Consider the moral difference between using human shields and being deterred by them. That is the difference we're talking about. The Israelis and other Western powers are deterred, however imperfectly, by the Muslim use of human shields in these conflicts, as we should be. It is morally abhorrent to kill non-combatants if you can avoid it. It's certainly abhorrent to shoot through the bodies of children to get at your adversary. But take a moment to reflect on how contemptible this behavior is, and understand how cynical it is. The Muslims are acting on the assumption, the knowledge in fact, that the infidels with whom they fight, the very people whom their religion does nothing but vilify, will be deterred by their use of Muslim human shields. They consider the Jews to be the spawn of apes and pigs, and yet they rely on the fact that they don't want to kill Muslim non-combatants. Now imagine reversing the roles here. Imagine how fatuous, indeed how comical it would be, for the Israelis to attempt to use human shields to deter the Palestinians. Of course that would be ridiculous. The Palestinians are trying to kill everyone. Killing women and children is part of the plan. Reversing the roles here produces a grotesque Monty Python skit. If you're going to talk about the conflict in the Middle East, you have to acknowledge this difference. I don't think there's any ethical disparity to be found anywhere that is more shocking or consequential than this.
I find those arguments very, very, very hard to argue with.
Yeah, that's right. What was the movie? I mean, I think I've heard it a few different ways, a few different times. I think one was Kaiser Sose saying, the difference between this and that is how far one is willing to go to obtain their goals. And so, of course, Kaiser Sose famously shoots his own children and wife before he kills everybody else and their families. One could say something sort of similar about the zealots on top of what is it, Masada. They only took their own lives so as not to be subject to the Romans as slaves. But that death cult mentality versus a culture of living and striving for something better is a striking one, and it's not one that's easy to deal with in war. Because if they're willing to put up with anything and do anything, well, you pretty much have to fight fire with fire at some point.
I just think that the moral difference between people who will literally go out of their way to kill, at this point, the death toll is over 700, to kill non-combatants, just literally to pull them out.
Including their own. I mean, they literally sacrifice, like Harris said, we know this is true, that they have stationed armaments, even battlements in hospitals, famously in the UN hospital, in schools, in residential apartments. They routinely do this.
And they routinely kill non-combatants like they have in this case.
They go
as
after
soon as
the
they get a
soft
chance.
targets. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, in addition to the State Department having to delete that tweet, there are others who are rather less embarrassed by their thoughts, like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib. And of course, today, there have been large demonstrations in Miami, in New York, in Chicago, and Los Angeles in support of Hamas. And, everyone is talking about, well, this is all because of the occupation. You mean the occupation where the Israelis left in 2005, where they actually forced Israelis to leave their homes in the Gaza Strip to pull them all out, to create basically a Palestinian state in Gaza? And of course, when you say that, the response is, well, of course, they still control the borders and there's still a blockade on it. Well, yes, one of the reasons for that blockade is because of their irritating propensity to fire missiles into Israel, and Israel is trying to prevent that from happening. So yes, there is a blockade.
And there's also a blockade on the Egyptian side. They don't fire any rockets into Egypt.
Yes, that is true. One of the things you never hear about is the Egyptian blockade. The Egyptians don't want to have anything to do with these guys, and Yet somehow, and I suspect it is through Egypt, plenty of weapons are apparently getting through.
Yeah, they have the tunnels.
Yeah, there is some speculation that some of these weapons, I mean, the Palestinians largely use Soviet era weapons. However, there have been several pictures of these people running around with M16s, M4s, and whatnot, so there's a lot of speculation that somehow these weapons have made it from Afghanistan into the Palestinian territories. Is that true? I don't know. We would need to capture some of those weapons and begin running serial numbers to be sure. Further speculation that some of them may be coming from Ukraine as well, because there is a relatively thriving black market in Ukraine for Western aid as well. Certainly not all of it reaches the front lines. The Biden administration, back on, of all days, September 11th, released an additional $6 billion to the Iranians. And I love the government's idea. Well, look, this $6 billion that we released, now that's all for humanitarian purposes. And we're looking at that very carefully, and we're ensuring that they can only spend it on certain things, which may...
And in fact, it hasn't even been released yet.
Yeah, it hasn't
it couldn't have been spent on that.
Yeah, it hasn't even been released
yet. The
yet.
word fungible didn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Which, if I have $6 billion in the bank that you say I can spend on X, then I can take the stuff that I'm currently spending on X and spend it on Y. And you don't know what I'm doing spending on Y. Whether or not I spend that $6 billion is kind of immaterial. Money is fungible. And of course, it's not just that $6 billion. We can go back all the way to the Obama administration, where we literally flew pallets of cash into Iran, which I'm certain were used for just purely humanitarian purposes, of course. So there is such a moral blindness in the West.
It's a purposeful moral blindness.
Yeah, that's the only thing I can think. It has to be purposeful. I mean,
from the left's perspective, it's all about power imbalances. And because Israel is stronger, militarily, economically, fundamentally better lives, then they are the ones that have to show restraint. Like, you can't pick on your little brother. You're bigger than him. You're older than him. You're supposed to know better. So what does the little brother do? Oh, now I've got an advantage. I can go and whack you. And then when you come after me, mom's going to get on your case and not mine.
Well, yeah. I mean look, the Israelis are going to hit back. They've already started in terms of bombings.
They've declared war for the first time in 50 years.
Yeah, but the Israelis are going to hit back. And the second that Israeli soldiers cross into the Gaza Strip, the clock will reset to zero in the global mainstream media, and they will act as if this is a direct attack from Israel on the Gaza Strip for reasons unknown. All we know is that Big Bully Israel is once again, attacking Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they'll characterize it as a war of expansion, of territorial expansion, and not a defensive war, much like the 6-Day War. And since I saw earlier that Hezbollah has now gotten involved as well, I mean, we don't know what's going to go on up north as well.
Of course, because that brings us into Lebanon and also Syria. We have gone in the space of 3 years from the Abraham Accords to what looks like it could be the start of World War III.
Yep. Certainly another 6-day war. Well, it'll be longer than 6 days this time, but maybe, I don't know. The unknown factor is how much does Iran have to backstop Hezbollah and Hamas, and who else might join in? Qataris, maybe Turkey, who knows? And with what? So it's, yeah, there's a great unknown here. We're going to find out, I think, in pretty short order just how formidable any of these Middle East states are. But it is going to be combined with a general opprobrium from the United Nations, from, I'm sure, the European Union, from all these other world bodies, aka third world debating clubs. Um, and they're going to be pilloried in the press. U.S. and private industry are going to be excoriated and pressured to disengage entirely. They're going to compare it to South Africa in the 80s. It's going to be the same rigmarole they always do, but at a much higher pitch, much higher level.
Yes, because this time there is a possibility that Israel might just end the Hamas threat
Altogether.
once and for all. Although I think that's probably not going to happen. There's only one way that you could end the Hamas threat once and for all, and that would be to find and kill every single Hamas member, and beyond that, every single Hamas supporter. Um, it it would the only way to really,
It would help to take out the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
yeah, but I mean, Hamas has so much support. I mean, every time, well, they've only had the chance one time, but whenever the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip were given a choice to have a democratic government, they chose Hamas. So, absent a genocidal ethnic cleansing, what you do, even with a massive attack, where you manage to find every Hamas supporter you can, put them up against the wall and shoot them, even that is just biding for time.
Mm-hmm.
Because their kids, who are 8 or 9 years old, are still going to grow up in a school system that teaches, death to Israel, from the river to the sea, and all of that. I mean, at this point, they are building a multi-generational terrorist state.
I mean, they already have.
Yes.
And that's been going on for, decades. And for one reason. I mean, the Palestinians, and let's not forget here, people forget this all the time. There are nearly as many Palestinian refugees in Jordan as there are in Gaza and the West Bank. The Palestinian, there was never a Palestine.
There was an area called British Mandate Palestine.
That's all it was. It was not its own self-governing country. It was a British mandate after World War I. So these people who were refugees after the 1948 war, when Israel said, "Screw you," they got attacked by all sides in one day, and they pushed everybody back, took over all that territory, and then slowly pulled back, traded land for peace. There was what critics call an ethnic cleansing, where Palestinians were kicked out of Israel, and Israelis were kicked out of places like Jordan, which was it still Transjordan? I guess it was still Transjordan for a little bit after that, and Egypt and wherever else. And so they all went to Israel. And that's why the right to return is such a big claim for Palestinians. They want to go back to their homes. Well, a lot of you just left on your own. You weren't all that forced out. You didn't want to be there with a bunch of Jews.
Well,
not to mention all the Israelis were actually kicked out.
It actually goes further beyond that, because once you had the refugee problem in 1948, right, every single Arab country ensured that none of those refugees could ever be integrated into their countries. It happened in Lebanon. Right. It happened in Jordan. As you just mentioned, there are still refugee camps in Jordan.
They are not Jordanians. That's right.
Yeah, which by the way, contain literally probably no one now who was alive in 1948. And yet they're still refugees in Jordan. And Jordan intentionally keeps them as refugees. By the way,
and Jordan is actually on fairly good terms with Israel.
So did the Egyptians. Let's not forget that the Gaza Strip is not something the Israelis created.
That's right.
The Egyptians created it as a refugee because they refused to allow any of the Palestinian refugees to go to Egypt, just as the Jordanians refused, and just as the Syrians and the Lebanese refused to allow any of the Palestinian refugees to integrate into their society. They intentionally kept them in refugee camps for 5 decades, and indeed longer than that, since, as you point out, in Jordan, they're still in refugee camps. And when the PLO got a little too strong and got a little too uppity in Jordan, the king of Jordan sent the army in to massacre them. They serve as a useful whipping boy, but that's all the Arab states have ever wanted, and all that they've ever used them for is a whipping boy against Israel.
They're the tip of the spear. They are literally an implanted nuisance in the side of Israel.
Because
that is their function.
Because without the refugee camps, you get no PLO, you get no Yasser Arafat. What you get are families who end up settling in Syria or Lebanon or Jordan and becoming Jordanians or Egyptians or whatever. And then the problem goes away. I mean, you have to at least give the Arabs credit for having enough foresight to realize that they needed, at all costs, to keep these refugee camps running.
They certainly have a stick-to-itiveness.
Yeah, and to not allow any of these people entry into their countries to become citizens of their countries, because then, of course, the impetus of the entire Palestinian problem goes away. There are, indeed, no more Palestinians if you assimilate them. And why wouldn't you assimilate them if you did not have some malign political purpose, which clearly the Arab states did, because the Palestinian problem was, of course, the impetus for the 1956 and 1967 and 1973 wars, all of which Israel won. And this is just a continuation of that. And I think the big change now, even among parties of the left who've now offered to create a unity government with Benjamin Netanyahu, I think there's going to be widespread realization that after 50 years of trying, trading land for peace is simply not going to work. So,
no, two-state solution didn't work. I mean, everything that was.
Well, this is the thing. Everything the Labor Party tried to do in Israel since the 1979 Arab-Israeli Accords. Of course, that was Menachem Begin. That wasn't Labor Party, so I do understand. But everything that the Labor Party has tried to do since 1979, and here's where we end up. We're literally right back where we started.
Right.
So it's an intractable conflict, but it's intractable because one side doesn't want to end it. And that is one of the geopolitical realities that I think so many people forget. It doesn't matter whether you want war or peace, and it doesn't matter how much you want peace or how wonderful peace is. Both sides have to want peace.
Right.
And if one side doesn't, then you'll never have it. And this idea that we can somehow, through calm and soothing words and diplomacy, turn people who are committed to war onto a path of peace is just foolishness. The side that wants a war is going to get it.
It's really not any different when you think about it than, other than in motivation, than the Danish invasion of England, which they almost completely accomplished. We'd pay them, or England would pay them Danegeld, which they'd use to build up, buy more ships, buy more men, and then go right back to raiding again. And, the English did win a lot of decisive battles, enough to keep themselves somewhat, very afloat. But in the end, it ended up being a mix of the two. But that took quite a long time.
I mean, it takes us off the subject, but it did create a unified England, which had not existed prior to the Danes.
That is right.
And it created an England that was largely oriented towards Scandinavia as an Anglo-Saxon country. It wasn't until the invasion of the Normans in 1066, descendants of Vikings, because the original Duke of Normandy was Ragnar Lothbrok's brother, who was given that dukedom by the king of, who was given that kingdom by that dukedom by the king of France to say, hey, why don't you attack other people instead of France?
Those guys.
Yeah, why don't you go after those guys? And of course, 200 years later, that's exactly what they did, which of course reoriented England away from being an Anglo-Saxon polity to an Anglo-French policy, and sort of angled them towards continental Europe, away from Scandinavia. Obviously a big shift in geopolitics for the time. Anyway, bit of an aside. For those of us who are history buffs, though, it may be interesting. But
sorry, I have a hard time avoiding the historical parallels.
Yeah. So there's if one side wants war, you don't have a choice. You have to give it to them. But the thing I think that bothers me more than anything else is, does this draw the United States in some way? Clearly, Iran is involved. Other Middle Eastern states. I think it's interesting because there is so much fear of Iran. What sort of, at least tacit approval there might be for pulling Iran up short from the Saudis and other Sunni majority countries there. But didn't we just have a 20-year global war on terror that was supposed to fix this?
Yeah, I thought so. Matter of fact, isn't it still going on? Was that ever declared over?
Well, I guess after we left Iraq and Afghanistan, that was effectively the end of the global war on terror. Nobody deploys over there anymore. But, I mean, clearly that didn't accomplish anything. I don't know what I don't know what we can accomplish. And look, this is not 1940. The United States has neither the trustworthy institutions, the manufacturing capacity, the oil refineries, or any of the other advantages that we had in 1941 after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor to engage in a global war. I don't think that we have the ability to do that the way that we did in 1941. So I have no idea. I have no idea where this ends. All I do know is that Hamas managed to single-handedly turn Ukraine into America's side piece.
Well, I do know that there is I think a carrier group that has been sent to the Mediterranean to support Israel. And Israel is an actual ally as opposed to
and the Persian Gulf,
Ukraine. And, well, the Persian Gulf is, one thing that Arab is an ally. So we've been controlling that, the Straits of Hormuz, for at least trying to, for a very long time. But like you said, getting involved in Israel is also getting involved with Iran, which is also getting involved with Russia. It's all kind of linked together.
Well, see, that's the thing. We're already facing off against Russia, at least by proxy, in Ukraine. Are we about to do that again with Iran? And by the way, what happens if because here's where it starts to get tricky. What happens if the Israelis go in and they just start flattening the Gaza Strip? I mean, I assume they'll show some level of restraint, but probably not anywhere near as much as they have in the past.
No.
They've declared war. They'll probably go in as if it were a war. So then what does Iran do as a response? Do they become involved in a state-on-state conflict against Israel? Do they have the guts to do that? And if they do that, Israel has nuclear weapons. They don't admit it, but we know that they do. So what happens if they nuke Tehran or Qom or any other major Iranian power center. There are two, really, Qom and Tehran. So what happens if they nuke it? Then what? Then where are we? This has the seeds, at least, of the possibility of this thing spiraling out of control.
And very quickly.
Because you can't depend. It's one of the points I think we made several years ago. During the Cold War, despite the fact that we were constantly engaged in proxy conflicts in either, first on a very small scale in Greece and the Balkans, and then in Korea, then ultimately Vietnam, we always had the sense, especially after Stalin shuffled off this mortal coil, we always had the sense that the Soviets, despite the fact that they were big troublemakers, they could always be counted on to be legalistic. They at least shared a worldview with us, at least in their public statements and in their general actions, that they would comply with international law. And anytime that they made a move, they always tried to do so with some sort of pretext that gave some sort of international law gloss over it. For example, the invasion of Afghanistan was not, in fact, an invasion. There was a change in the government of Afghanistan, and the Afghanistan government invited the Soviet Union in to help ensure peace and stability. We always could count on them to be rational. And the big confrontation that we had with the Soviet Union in 1961 or 62 rather, with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians were not willing to risk global thermonuclear war over Cuba. They were willing to test to see if we would allow them to, but when it became apparent that we wouldn't, Nikita Khrushchev backed down. And in fact, we know that Khrushchev's gamble on Cuba so scared the rest of the Soviet leadership that Leonid Brezhnev overthrew him and instituted, at least initially, a much more collegial, Politburo-based leadership style of a group of leaders rather than a single supreme dictator, the way that Stalin had been and Khrushchev largely was. We could always count on them to at least be rational and to at least appear publicly, to the extent that they could, to be in compliance with international norms.
To at least act like they were actually a world power on the stage. I mean, they were a world power, but to act with the same sort of
restraint that you would expect a world power, and the same sort of respect for international law, even though that respect in reality was probably less so than...
Well, it was amongst all of them, to be honest.
Yeah. But that's not a situation that obtains in the Middle East.
No.
I mean, the Iranian government is run by people who are true believers in the Quran, and they truly believe that the Mahdi will return and that they will be victorious, and everything they do is in furtherance of that. You can't make rational predictions about what fanatics will do. And for better or worse, the Iranian government is a government run by religious fanatics. It makes it very difficult to predict how they'll respond to any given... I mean, we could do that with the Soviets. We had an idea of how they would respond, at least in some sense, to our responses to their activities and so forth. We don't have that same sort of assurance with Iran or with Afghanistan or, quite frankly, as it stands now, with Iraq or with Syria. We simply don't know.
That's true. Or Yemen or the Emirates or
Saudi Arabia, quite frankly.
Or even Saudi Arabia, because they're also a theocracy. Egypt may be the only one that's somewhat rational, even if it is a dictatorship. I guess what we call that a enlightened dictatorship back in the 1700s.
For certain,
an enlightened despot.
For certain definitions of enlightened, sure.
You're right that the restraints that one's leaders puts on its own actions is limited by worldview, by world norms. When you don't care about those norms because they're not your norms, and matter of fact, your norms go back to the 7th century and begin and end there, then all's fair. There's literally nothing but accomplishing the one goal. And nobody cares what anybody else thinks about it because they're driven by divine right. So, matter of fact, they're more than willing to be martyrs for the cause.
Yeah, they don't work under the same worldview.
That's right. There is no similar worldview at all.
Which makes this an intractable problem, as far as I can tell. The only way that you could, and I'm not even sure it would work. I guess we could use Imperial Japan as some sort of template, where you had a society that believed that the emperor was literally a descendant of the god Amaterasu, who was the human form of a god on earth and who would be deified upon the departure of his earthly shell. There was what we would have considered in the 1940s, and did in fact consider, an insane devotion to the emperor. And indeed, in our peace settlement with Japan, despite the fact that we had asked for unconditional surrender and largely got it, we did so with at least a tacit understanding that we would not overthrow the emperor. Hirohito was never called up under a war crimes tribunal. He was never prosecuted for anything. We found a middle ground. But to find that middle ground, we had to basically bomb every Japanese city to rubble. And ultimately use nuclear bombs to do that. The Japanese
even after the first in Hiroshima, they still wanted to go on. Matter of fact, if I recall correctly, Hirohito was saying we really need to back down. Maybe it's time we stop. And his leaders were saying, no, we need to keep going.
Well, no, it wasn't just after the first bomb. After the second bomb in Nagasaki, and the emperor had finally decided to capitulate, there was an attempted military coup.
Yeah, that is what I'm recalling. To
keep the war going.
Right.
Ultimately, the emperor won, and his rescript was broadcast to the Japanese people, and they obeyed. But of course, that reverence to the emperor played into our hands in that sense, in that once the emperor said, "This is over," the war situation has not necessarily gone in a satisfactory manner, or words to that effect.
Right.
And he never actually said surrender. He said, it is now our part to endure the unendurable. And, okay, it worked. I don't think that would work in the Middle East, because unlike Japan, let's say we were to do it. Let's say that in the best of all possible worlds, we had A, the political will, B, the competence, and C, the resources to massively invade Iran and bomb it back into, if not the Stone Age, at least into the Age of Reason, and we were to occupy the country. Well, there is no central single authority to whom Iranians are obliged to listen.
Right.
Every imam...
Yeah, they don't have an avatar of God on this earth.
They don't have a pope. Every imam has his own religious following. So we couldn't even depend on a situation like we had in Japan, who were very fanatical about the emperor, but we kept the emperor, and we used him as a tool. Ultimately, he's the one who went to visit Doug MacArthur.
Right. As
sort of his, formal capitulation to the occupation. That wouldn't happen in Iran. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan and accomplished nothing. Are we willing to spend now another 20 years and God knows how much blood and treasure with a country that's already $33 trillion in debt we're like 130, 135% of GDP. We're basically have a higher rate of debt to GDP than we had at the end of World War II. Could we start another war like that? I don't think so. We are limited in what we can do. And it's just part of this sense that I've got that the whole world is just spinning out of control.
Well, that's part of the one of my favorite topics is chaos theory, and one of the overly simplified um, uh, notions within chaos theory is that the more things get connected and interconnected, the greater chance of having a single fail point. And so, if you have a single fail point, the entire system becomes explosive at any time. And with the interconnectedness of the world now, and with really only one superpower, us, um, when we fail, when our leadership fails, and I'd include in that the leadership of really the entire Anglosphere and Europe. Without that leadership of Western thought, then prosperity is going to drop everywhere, and people are going to get restless and start, going their own way. And who's going to stop it?
There was a lot of speculation after the end of the Cold War that we would slowly sort of revert back to a great power system. And that you would have the European Union as a power, the United States as a power, the Russian Federation as a power, and then you would have regional power. You would have China, India as a regional power, Japan, and that there would be this big multipolar world. I think we'll be lucky if the degradation we're seeing in the international scene ends with a multipolar pre-World War I great powers type of power structure. I think that at this point is the best case scenario. My fear is that we just devolve into basically local warlords.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the political class, the world political class, would be happy to go back to the Ancien regime, where they get to stay in charge and tell everybody what to do. That certainly seems to be their goal. It's really flattening, everybody who isn't of a certain class, and certainly those trying to enter into that political class. They try to pull up all the ladders and make life as miserable for as many people as possible.
Yeah, well, look, at this point, I think that's a pipe dream because that relies on the idea that you're going to have this global elite who get to run everything relies on the idea that the current international system that we have is actually stable and actually works and actually enables them to execute the power in that way. If this thing devolves too far, people like Klaus Schwab will have no power whatsoever because they will have no means of control for the vast majority of the world. There may be
Well,
some...
that's right, because if they don't have it, the only way to control that is through institutions. And if there's no trust in the institutions, then
they can't
people
be
just won't listen.
Yeah, they can't be relied on to exercise that power. I mean, the whole World Economic Forum idea rests implicitly on the idea that people will trust their institutions and they will do what their institutions will tell them to do. And that, I think, is increasingly not true.
Especially with the pandemic and the way our institutions behaved. And what's interesting, too, is because it was such a global phenomenon that we saw the laboratories of, well, not necessarily democracy, but at least the laboratories of government at work, and how effective each one of the governing styles was. In the end, it was Sweden who came out the best at the end, and they did little to nothing. Um, Whereas the super crackdowners did worse. New Zealand, many places in Europe, although even Europe wasn't as bad as the United States in a lot of places like New York, California, Michigan, they did much worse. And we now have that data and people know it. It's actually out there. I mean, they're going to be the true believers, the chronically need to be oppressed and fearful, who just won't buy it, who have never stopped wearing masks and don't understand why nobody will wear masks. But aside from those idiots, most people, in real world have a pretty darn good idea what happened and why it happened. And that's why trust in institutions is so incredibly low. Media plays a big part in that. Their trust is way low. Government was back behind all of it, and it's not doing too well right now either.
And by the way, government is still trying to do that. They're still trying to impose censorship, although the Fifth Circuit really put a big kibosh on that this last week. The FBI going after domestic terrorists, considering...
Of the MAGA variety.
Of course, which I guess we'd now lump them in with Catholics. As domestic terrorists, and also parents who go to school board meetings and who are upset as domestic terrorists. There are a lot of people of goodwill on both sides of the aisle who realize that is a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
There are still on the left a lot of people who support free speech and who support, at least in their concept of limited government, at least a government that's limited from violating our fundamental constitutional rights. And people do not trust the government anymore. Plus, the well-publicized cases about how the government is just wrong about so many things. Last week we brought up the food pyramid, where the government for 40 years told us to eat bread at every bread, macaroni, whatever it is, as long as it's grain-based carbs, that needs to be 70% of your diet.
Right.
That turns out to be not medically good advice.
Yeah, not such a good idea.
Yeah, and so, there are people who realize that government is the problem. And I would say in the United States, probably about half of the population thinks of government as a problem. And certainly a much greater proportion, believe that, who do not live in major urban areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to split that down a little bit, I think it's more than a majority. I mean, maybe not a vast majority, but close to 2/3 would say, in the very least, that for the past 4 years or so, this government has not been effective, is not doing a good job. And then among that, there's a subset that probably just less than half that really just don't trust government, to begin with, and think it should be a lot smaller. And then, of course, there's that contingent that believes no government would be a great idea.
Yeah, well, it's a mess, and this thing in Israel, this attack in Israel, has the potential to blow up into. I think of the Middle East much as the same way that pre-World War I Europeans thought of the Balkans. It's just a tinderbox. And nothing we did there for 20 years has changed that a single iota. All of that blood and treasure was a complete waste of time. And
bring back the Ottoman Empire.
And
let them deal with it.
Yeah, Turkey would probably be very happy to step up and do that. So anyway, I just don't know I don't know the way out. But but don't think that this is not in some way linked back, at least indirectly, to Russia. Because Russia has been, and was, while it was the Soviet Union, the world's largest sponsor of global terrorism. That has not changed. And so how much of this Iranian money was also funneled through Russia? Interesting
Oh,
question.
yeah. Well, and let's face it. I mean, the Russians have been supplying Iran with arms, missiles, and all kinds of stuff. So,
And the Iranians
there's
have
no
been supplying the Russians with drones and whatnot for their war
right,
in
and
Ukraine.
oil.
I mean, it's not hard to connect the dots here.
Right.
And
Well, and China also had its part to play in this.
oh
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. Let's not forget the
talk about
Chinese.
beggar thy neighbor. You know, once they realized that what an issue this COVID-19 was going to be, they made sure to spread it around the world, hide the source as best as possible, wait it out until it was too late, and then have everybody suffer instead of just them. And they've done the same thing with the economic markets. Once China senses trouble, and China is in economic trouble right now, they're trying to spread that around as well. So, it's China tries to make sure that they can stay afloat by bringing everybody else down to their level, and Russia just tries to make everybody weaker in order for them to at least rise up to a level where they can gain territorial advantage.
Yeah, well, China has additional pressures in that they are not self-sufficient in food. They are
Right.
not self-sufficient in energy. And they're not self-sufficient in technology.
Which is crazy. I mean, they should be, by all rights, able to do all of those things, except for communism.
Exactly. They have a communist government. If the Chinese people were allowed to actually have a free country, well, I mean, they still have a horrific demographic problem. And their population
Well,
is set to
and
decline
what caused
by,
that?
yeah, and that was caused by communism, the one-child policy. So,
Right.
so China.
I mean, you just compare Hong Kong, to the rest of China and how they grew. I mean, Hong Kong took a little tiny portion with no natural resources to speak of, really none, and became one of the freest, richest places on earth.
And the Chinese managed to ruin
What
that
does
when
China
they
do?
took over in 1999.
That's right.
And so
And Hong Kongers are now leaving. They're going to go make someplace else rich.
which, by the way, look, Xi can't be so stupid. I mean, the fact is he shot the messenger so many times that nobody wants to give him bad news. And I think there's a very good chance that Xi does not truly understand the straits his country is in. But he must at least understand that by the end of the decade, China will have more retirees than they have workers. He's got to know that by the end of this century, the population of China will decline by half.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of international chaos that we started to see whenever Russia invaded Ukraine, and now we may be seeing a whole nother round of chaos. And look, I'd even go back farther than that. I think we sort of started a round of chaos with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. China has a very narrow time window to do anything that they want to do. And if they want Taiwan, that time we're in that window right now.
Unfortunately for them, I don't think they have the real ability to not only do such an invasion, but to hold on to an occupancy.
Yeah, the Defense Department came out with this deal a couple of weeks ago about how the Chinese have like almost a 1,000 ship navy. And it's the same kind of scary numbers that Caspar Weinberger used to publish every year in the famous DoD pamphlet, Soviet Military Power, 1982, and 83, and 84, and 85, which was really all scaremongering about how tough the Soviet Union was and how hard they would be to fight. We're doing this with China now, saying, the Chinese have a 1,000 ship navy. Technically, that's true. However, 700 of those ships are basically frigates and corvettes that can't operate more than 500 or 600 miles off the Chinese coast. China has a coastal...
How many of them are rowboats?
Yeah, the Chinese have a coastal defense navy. They have 1,000 ships that have a crew of 40, which, I imagine you can patrol the coast very well with such a navy. Projecting that power, sure. They have a training aircraft carrier now. They're building 2 more. But you know who else has aircraft carriers? Japan.
Mm-hmm.
With names that might be familiar to those of us who remember World War II. Akagi, Kaga. Japan has more, at this point, Japan has a more combat effective navy, and a navy that is able to project Japanese power, should the Japanese ever decide to do so again, that the Chinese do not have. But they might have enough ships to try an invasion of Taiwan. Whether they could win such an invasion.
Yeah, because Taiwan's no slouch. I mean, I don't know they have that much of a navy, but they have got some land forces that could be formidable, at least to repel taking a defensive stance. And then if China could successfully invade, could they successfully hold Taiwan?
And by the way,
that's a much bigger question.
India does have such a navy, by the way, which could cut off, India could, if they wanted, cut off all Chinese energy exports basically overnight.
Right.
India would just prevent anything leaving the Persian Gulf from going to China. Mm-hmm. Because there's basically one big honkin' sea lane where all of China's energy supplies come from the Middle East, and it can be blockaded easily. And in such a way that the Chinese could not counter it, because they could not get enough naval force there to destroy a blockading force.
I think Australia would have something to say about that too.
Yeah, because Australia does have a navy that, at least in terms of, especially the submarines that they're going to buy from us, they'd be able to.
Screw you, France.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's just that it seems that for the last 3 years we've just been watching everything slowly fall apart. And I don't know what the way back is. I'm pretty sure
slowly and suddenly.
I'm sure the way back is not to re-elect Donald Trump, but
that might be a way to stop the bleeding. I in 4 years, I don't know what he could accomplish, other than to kind of bring Washington to a standstill. I mean, actually, he wasn't bad on foreign policy at all.
Yeah, but look at how
he was quite effective.
But look at how his foreign policy statements have changed in this go around compared to 2016.
I have noticed that.
Now all of a sudden he's China's big friend.
Right.
And
he used to do that with China at the time too. Talk nice and then place tariffs on them.
Yeah. So his policy changes since his 2016 campaign have been all over the map.
He's done a lot of weird things lately.
Yeah,
I guess to distinguish himself from the, what critics would call the hard right, the DeSantis's. Is there really another hard right person? Not that I can think of in the running.
Yeah, by the way, chat says there is no way back. Things will never be the same. A change is coming.
An acolyte of Dale's Pessimism Club.
That sounds more like the way I end our podcast than someone from the chat. But yeah, I don't have a lot of optimism. Especially in terms of, America is lucky in a lot of ways. We are self-sufficient in food. We are a net food exporter.
That's correct. And we could be self-sufficient in energy, too.
Yeah, if we want to be, we can be self-sufficient in energy, and we can do so in a short amount of time. I mean, it would take a lead time of 2 or 3 years, but we can become totally self-sufficient in energy. We are in a position that very few countries in the world are, which is both a blessing and a curse, because what it also means is that assuming we're willing to fund a large enough military establishment to defend the United States and do nothing else but that, and as long as we know that we'll have the ability to eat and we know we won't freeze to death in the dark, we can go back to 1935 and tell the rest of the world to go to hell.
Yeah.
And if we do that,
that's going to bring, you think we have a lot of people trying to come into the country now.
Yeah. And if we do that, the world will go to hell.
Yeah.
But if we're going to do that, then this border policy we have will just have to go.
It needs to go either way, but
yeah,
it wouldn't have to just go. It would have to become even stronger than what's actually written into the law now, which isn't being enforced.
Oh, yeah.
It would have to be far more stringent.
Yeah, we would not only have to build the wall, we would have to patrol it, and we'd basically have to have an inflexible policy of deporting every single person who came across.
Right. Or shooting them. I mean, one or the other.
Yeah, or shooting them. You know?
I mean, that's how rotten the rest of the world would become, is that they would be deemed invaders. You know, this is a really strong hypothetical. But you're right, that we do have that advantage in our ability to be self-sustaining, especially just where we're situated. You know, we have 4 seasons. They're basically equal. We have long growing seasons. We have 2 coasts. We have access to lots of fishing, oil, coal, a lot of
nuclear
minerals. We have nuclear. We have literally
apparently lithium now.
Yeah, I heard about that. That's awesome. I also saw something. Sorry for the slight aside, but somebody's doing a salt reactor in the United States somewhere, I think.
Wait, a molten thorium salt reactor?
I'm not sure if it was thorium, but it was definitely a salt reactor.
Okay, good. They can't melt down.
Exactly. Amen. Let's hope that's true and it comes online soon.
You know, and by the way, we were talking 10 years ago or so about pebble bed reactors, and
yeah, right. Those are kind of passé at this point.
Yeah, that is another unmeltdownable reactor.
Right. Yeah, we know those thorium salt ones had lots and lots of promise. I know they've done them on a successfully small scale, but FERC just won't let them go any further. And, you know, the approval process takes like 10 years, and even then it might not happen. So,
well, an isolationist America would have to re-examine that policy.
Oh, yeah. If there were enough people in this country to vote in a block of politicians who held those views and would enforce them, yes, we would definitely be going balls to the wall when it comes to energy production, all types of it. I mean, everything above the board.
By the way,
sure,
you know
who else?
You know who else could be self-sufficient in food and energy if they didn't have such a corrupt government, and that would be Russia. Although they've got a
little bit tougher than us.
That would require that they take Ukraine, but
they would need the access to those warm seaports. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, technically they could be.
They could be. I mean, of course, Ukraine is where all the wheat's grown.
Yes. You kind of got to have Ukraine if you want to make Russia self-sufficient in food, because Russia really has a very narrow strip of arable land.
Right.
And they need every inch of it they can to survive. And how much of that calculation, by the way, is behind the invasion of Ukraine, I'm not sure either.
I mean, I'm sure it's there.
Because Ukraine is a major world exporter of grain.
That's right. It's one of the major exporters.
In fact, Ukraine has, for the last 20 years, basically fed Africa.
Right. That's exactly right. And then, I mean, Canada is essentially in the same boat as Russia.
Yes.
It's got a narrow band, but almost all its population lives right across the border with the United States.
Yes.
So,
Also, it's a country of 33 million people, not
right.
330
Much
million
smaller.
people. And
It's not even as big as California.
yeah, and Saskatchewan and uh, Manitoba can feed all of Canada, and certainly in Alberta
Oh,
and
yeah.
Saskatchewan,
Alberta, absolutely.
they have enough energy supplies to make Canada self-sufficient.
Yeah, that's right.
Although
I mean,
it's difficult to imagine a scenario in which Canada and the United States aren't working together in a significant way. Canada is our largest trading partner. It basically is our largest participant in basically any trade that goes on anywhere in the world. So Canada and the United States together, they're in a very good position. But there are so many countries that are not. China is not. India is not. No country in Africa is. Almost no country in Asia outside of India is self-sufficient in food. And India is only barely self-sufficient in food, and they're not self-sufficient in energy. So they wouldn't even really count. Central and South America, pretty iffy. Maybe Mexico might be self-sufficient in food and energy, maybe, if they really put their minds to it. But south
certainly
of
in
Mexico,
energy. Well, they can grow a lot of grain, but I'm not sure they can grow enough grain to actually support the entire country.
yeah, because so much of their country is jungle
Yeah.
or desert.
Or desert. Right.
Yeah, so they have they have unique challenges that the United States doesn't have. So I mean, those are all things to our advantage. But I just don't see our current global system lasting. I just don't see how it can, and I don't know what that looks like. But a very isolationist America wouldn't surprise me. And by the way, we already see it happening. We already see a huge portion of the population, indeed people in Congress, who are just dead set against any more funding for Ukraine, who don't want us to participate in there. There is a not unreasonable fear of having an escalation into a direct conflict with Russia. Nobody wants to see nuclear missiles flying over the poles. Isolationism is coming back in a big, big way. And for those of us who grew up in the era of globalism, we're going to have to recalibrate our thinking about international affairs.
Yeah. I mean, ever since the creation of the United Nations, which I kind of mark as the beginning of the downfall of Western civilization, we've just been sinking, sliding further and further into this kind of one world government where we all get along and everybody gets a say, and there's no accounting for values or culture, and everybody's the same. It just doesn't work that way. It never has, and it never will.
You mentioned the UN, and I just wanted to bring up something as an aside. The day after, we saw all sorts of horrific videos of these Hamas, and I guess we're not supposed to call them terrorists according to the New York Times. We have to refer to them as militants. Indeed, the CBC in Canada, their news department sent out an email being sure not to call people terrorists. And also,
I'm okay with militants. That means that they are a military and they are performing military actions. And
yes,
therefore, you can be defiantly and definitively have war declared upon.
Well, the day after these militants were shown on video, I mean, literally raping, murdering, and hauling women off back to the Gaza Strip as booty, the UN's Women's Commission came out today with a big campaign to support the rights of trans lesbians. Trans lesbians are lesbians too. Men are apparently better lesbians than women now.
It was either The Onion or Babylon B did a bit like that. I can't remember. It was a few years ago, maybe 4, 5, where feminist league finally gives up. Man takes over to do it right.
Yeah.
But we're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, well, that's the weird thing about this is just the men getting to take over women's spaces simply by saying that they're, women now.
They're women. Yeah.
And, of course, that gives rise to the trans exclusionary radical feminists and whatever.
We saw that thing at that big tech conference for women, the Grace Hopper, I think it's called, thing. And all these, young, allegedly male, supposedly male attendees signed up as non-binary, which they were welcome to do. Jesus Christ. And there's all kinds of caterwauling from the women there. This is supposed to be a women's space. Yeah. And trans. Well, they're saying they're trans. You can't call them out for that. That you're just being bigots. It's clear that they're not trans. Oh, really? How clear? How do you clear that up?
Yeah, how do you clear that up? I mean,
I'd love to know.
Define woman, and then we'll have a discussion. But anyway, here is the thing from UN Women today. Remember, trans lesbians are lesbians too. They even have a cute little poster to go along for it. George Orwell must be spinning in his grave like a machine lathe.
Hey, I'm a trans lesbian. I'll sleep with a lesbian.
So anyway, that was their big thing today at 9 a.m. They thought that was the important thing that the UN needed to get out today.
Well, priorities.
Yeah, well, you got to have them. I mean, if you don't have priorities, where are you?
All you're left with is a world debating club.
Yeah. So anyway, it's been an awful day and an awful weekend. I'm not sure what else that we can offer to it for today. I just know that it's just been a bad day and a bad weekend. Maybe for once something positive will happen in the next week, but until then, we'll have to put everything in abeyance. As always, pleasure talking to you, Michael. We'll talk to you again next week. You've been listening to the Q&O podcast. Well, it's not the Q&O podcast anymore. Q&O doesn't exist. It's the Observations podcast for Sunday, the 8th of October, 2023. As always, we thank you for joining us for the podcast. We hope you'll be with us again for the next one. In the interim, have a great week. So long.